David and I would like to thank you for the opportunity of interviewing a dear friend of ours. And so it's a cold, wet, horrible evening in the divided kingdom in the UK, but it's absolutely warming to the heart and soul to be able to speak to Kim this evening about her life, her work. And if you don't know her already, I believe you're in for a treat. She's over 40,000 reads of her publications, but perhaps for me what's more interesting is she's a mother and a granny, and she loves to laugh and entertain her grandchildren. And whenever I often speak to her, she will have been speaking to one of them and making up stories about naughty granny. And I think that this love and embracing of life and laughter in some way compensates for the sort of dark side of a lot of Kim's work. She's a researcher and a practitioner, and her work has looked at trauma, the body and transformation, reflexivity, counselling and health settings. But it began perhaps with her PhD looking at male survivors of childhood sexual abuse and some really dark issues. And through methodological challenges that she's faced in her work, she's really led innovative ways to communicate her work. In 2020, she received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, a wonderful achievement. And in 2022, she received the Lifetime Contribution Award in Autoethnography from the International Conference of Autoethnography. So I could go on and on talking about my dear friend Kim, but I want you to hear from her. So we'll curtail the wonderful achievements. She has a website. She's recently got involved and spearheaded an organization called Lapidus, which I think she'll tell us about a bit later on. But David, are you going to sort of kick us off with the interview?
If that's okay with you both. So we're looking forward to hearing about some of the areas of your work, Kim, that Kitrina's just mentioned. But before we do, we'd like to start off, I suppose, in autoethnography style with asking a little bit about you and your background. I'm very, I think we've all probably been affected. I certainly have by Art Bochner's 2014 book, Coming to Narrative, where I've seen certain common ground that I've been through that Art explores in that book. But I'm also aware that we're from the UK, we've got our own particular cultural backgrounds, our own professional, personal experiences. So I wonder if we could start by inviting you to tell us a little bit about your own journey of coming to narrative, autoethnography and research from the cultural, personal and professional situations you were in when you began.
Right. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm just recovering from COVID, so probably not at my 100% best, but probably good enough. Yes, I mean, that book you mentioned of Art's, I think I wrote to you, Art, at the time. I just felt it was really brilliant. But I have to say, the one book that brought me to autoethnography was Carolyn's book, Final Negotiations, which I'd read way, way back. I think it was in 1995. And that was the year in which I got my PhD. So it was just a little bit late for me in terms of that respect. But we were talking a little bit about this yesterday, Kitrina and David and I, and this idea of coming to narrative. And I didn't know I was going to say this, but I said, actually, I think for me it was very different, because I don't think I came to narrative. I think narrative was kind of born in me, you know. I was born in 1940 in Liverpool, the capital of Ireland, they say. It's not really. Made famous by the Beatles and one or two other people. But both my parents were from Ireland and had grown up in Ireland and had actually met in England. So I grew up on the Irish stories of how the bloody British hung our young men at the crossroads at midnight, and the black and tans being emptied out of the British jails and brought over to keep the Irish in place. But all quite dark, heavy stories. While I was English, and this was very confusing in terms of my identity, of course, growing up, hearing my parents' attitudes to the English, living in England and being English. I was born into a family with 8 brothers, 6 of whom were born before me. And I was introduced by my mother to people as the only girl, the freak of the family. So it was quite an impressive time in terms of how things shaped my sense of myself and identity. In terms of research, and I mean, stories kept me alive, actually, as a child. I spent a lot of time in the local library, looking for books to take home. And they were usually great, big, fat sagas. You know, at the age of 12, I was reading Mrs. Gaskell, North and South, and all sorts of books that were really way beyond my years. But what they did was to give me an idea of different kinds of lives, preferable lives, I have to say, from my own. So stories did really keep me alive. And of course, then I started to write. I didn't know what I was writing, but looking back years later, I realized that I was processing my childhood trauma as I went along. I wrote a lot of so-called poems, which were full of longing and loneliness. And yeah, it's quite touching to go back and read those now and to think that did keep me alive. But when it came to, I qualified as an occupational therapist in 1961 at the age of 21 and went into the health service, which of course, research-wise, was a completely unknown world to me. My husband was doing a PhD in biochemistry, and he would come home and he would get terribly excited about little blobs of color on paper that meant absolutely nothing to me. He wore a white coat and spent days in the lab, and he was a proper scientist. So never in 1,000 years, if somebody had told me that I would be someday doing a degree called a Master of Science, would I have ever believed them? But I switched from being an occupational therapist. I brought up, I think it was 1.5 years after I qualified as an occupational therapist, working in child guidance clinics. Funny that really, isn't it? That's the first job I had in need of child guidance, and I go and do the job looking after other children. Went into working in community psychiatric day hospitals, moving more into the mental health field. Then ended up doing 8 years in a community for autistic people, and then 8 years in social services. And it was really when I was in social services that I decided that a lot of the people I was seeing, they didn't really need me to go in and assess their needs for daily living in terms of bath aids. They really needed somebody to talk to. And so I went and started to train with the first ever counselling course in the University of Bristol, which was about 25 miles away from where I was living. And that changed my life completely, really. It was during that time that I started to be a client myself, and really start to think about myself. My whole focus had been out towards others. As the only girl in an all-male household, I was taught that my focus was to look outwards and to take care of my brothers and my mother and my father. And I really had no idea about myself. So, of course, I became a carer, again, looking after other people. But then when I was asked to start to think about what was making me tick, it was quite a powerful experience of actually being listened to and actually discovering things about myself that I didn't know. So at any time before this, if anybody had asked me to use myself in research, there was no self that I could have actually used. I had the stories of my upbringing, and I had the stories that other people had told me, about me and about themselves, but nothing really about myself. So it was really like a little mini explosion went off when I became a counsellor. And I became very excited about learning. I'd never really enjoyed learning. I was absent and dissociated most of my time through school. And then suddenly I found this whole new world, and I discovered that I could actually do it. And of course, the writing, for the first time, really, I started to write. And I was told by one of the examiners that I was a writer. And this was astonishing to me. But then no sooner had we started this 2-year postgraduate diploma that it was finished and I was bereft. So then I started knocking on the door of my tutor saying, what's the next course to do? And she said, go away, we haven't got a next course. But then eventually they decided that they would do a master's degree in counselling, training and supervision. And I joined 24 other people on that course. Now here, we were expected to do some research, and we weren't taught anything. We weren't even pointed in a direction. We were just left to do it. And I ended up doing a study of father-daughter relationships and the impact on adult women's lives of those relationships. And it was a heuristic inquiry, which meant that I had to do a lot of indwelling, personal reflection. We were encouraged to be creative, and I just completely went for it. I did actually interview 12 other people on the topic, which I look back now and I think, how did I do that? You know, this was a 12,000-word dissertation, and I interviewed 12 people, but it was fascinating and I loved it and I learned an awful lot. And of course, before the master's was finished, I was thinking, where am I going to go now? So before I'd finished the master's, I'd actually signed up to do a doctorate. I was teaching by this time in the university for the general public, or people who came and signed up for courses. And one of the courses I was teaching was about working with abuse survivors, because in these days, remember, this is a long time ago, I'm talking about 1990. There wasn't very much known about this, and counsellors on the whole were a bit scared of this whole idea. So as somebody whom I had received my own counselling for my own abuse in early childhood, I thought, you know, I'm going to tell you what we need. I'm going to tell you what people need when they've gone through this. And I'd received quite a lot of really good stuff by then. So I started to talk to groups of people, spent days training them. And on one of these days, somebody introduced herself as a PhD student. And I said, how'd you do that? How'd you get to do a PhD? Where'd you go? There was nobody in my department who had a PhD. So she told me to go to the Department of Social Policy and asked to speak to a certain person. And off I trotted. And I spoke to this woman who was terribly encouraging. And I signed on to do a PhD before I'd finished my master's. And I started doing the literature review because I just wanted to know. And of course, nothing in England really was written about it, but America had some really quite good little areas of expertise. So I went to the library, I filled my rooms with books, and I immersed myself in the topic. I interviewed 25 men who had been sexually abused in childhood, some of whom had never actually spoken about it before. And I ended up suffering from vicarious traumatization. But I knew I wanted to hear their stories. I wanted to hear the stories of the people the man in the street, the people whose stories were not heard. The only stories that we knew about, well, they weren't really stories, they were reports by psychologists, were those who had been imprisoned for their offences and those who were in a clinical population. But I just knew that there must be people walking around the streets, never having spoken to anybody before, not in any prison, not in any clinical population. And so I went out to find these people and I gathered their stories. And I could tell you a huge story about how difficult it was to find men to actually sign up to do this. It was a huge learning experience. And after I'd finished that, I wrote a book from the PhD. I got my PhD in 95. The book was published in 95. And it sank like a stone to the bottom of the sea. Nobody really wanted to know anything about this. And the stories were actually pretty horrific. But after that, I felt I really did know quite a lot about this. And a lot of male survivors beat a pathway to my door. And I did some really interesting work until I had a letter via the university one day from a man who had read this book before it had sunk. He read it, and he was very excited because he himself had just discovered that this was his history, and he was in a terrible state of PTSD. And he asked if he could come and work with me. He lived a long way away, but he still wanted to do it. So after I'd been working with him for some time, he asked if his brother could come and see me too. They'd both experienced the same abuse without really knowing about it. They didn't know that each of the other had it from their grandfather. And so I then started to see the brother separately. And at the end of the time we worked together, they went their separate ways, but they contributed to some papers that I was writing after this. And then they kept saying to me, we've got so much more we want to say. You know, we could write a book ourselves. And then when we struggled to find people who were writing about this, we could be the people supporting those who are looking. And so that was the first book, the book I really still love, and the book that I'm proudest of is called Narrative Approaches to Working with Adult Male Survivors of Childhood Sexual Abuse. A nice pithy title, which the publishers insisted upon. I wanted to call it Where Three Streams Meet, but they didn't think that would tell the story enough for people to buy it. So that was when I really allowed myself to do it how I wanted to. So we sat together and we worked out how are we going to do this. We worked through all the ethical issues of an ex-counselor, an ex-client working together. The many, many, many layers of ethical issues that would be involved in this. And in chapter 22 of that book is actually a recording. It's full of I took it from a verbatim recording, and we covered everything from power in the therapeutic relationship to money to whether they use pseudonyms. It was a really in-depth and interesting piece of work. And I interviewed them about our relationship, about the beginning, the middle, and the end, the moments that had stood out for them, and so on and so on. And it's full of allegories and fairy stories and poems they wrote, little stories that they wrote. So I'd always used storytelling and story writing in my therapeutic work. And I suppose this is how, as I say, this is the journey I came to narrative. And the big turning point for me, because I was trained as a humanistic psychotherapist, based on the individual model of self, the autonomous bounded self. But then I tripped over narrative therapy one exciting day, and I started reading about social constructionism and post-structuralism, and it completely blew my mind. And from that day, it changed my practice, it changed my research thinking, and I started to think about, you know, this isn't about an individual model of self. This is about selves and identities and co-construction and so on, all the things we're very familiar with. So, does that tell you a little bit about the answer to the question?
Kim, you touched on very briefly there that you used allegories and poems and different writing styles. And I mentioned to you yesterday a question that students often ask me is about how to write about other people in their families when they don't have ethical consent, or what to do about some of the ethical challenges when they can't get ethical approval from someone anymore. And we had a really lovely conversation around that. Could you talk a little bit more about the methodological challenges that you faced with the ethics of naming people and what you have tried to do?
Well, my allegories and metaphors and poems and things like that were not really designed to disguise the identities of people. It was more about a way of telling the story, different ways of telling the story. But one of the things that I did a book called Trauma, the Body and Transformation, in which I invited 12 others, including myself, to write their story of whatever kind of trauma they'd experienced, however they'd lived it through their own bodies, and how they came to transform it. I just wanted to have a whole breadth of understandings about the different ways that people come to heal themselves. Counselling is not the only way. And that was the message I was trying to get across. And I wrote my own story. I had actually written my own story and been published in 2 national newspapers, but under a pseudonym. I really hadn't allowed myself to use my name. It just felt far too big and far too scary. And it freed me up no end. So simply using a pseudonym. But in this book, it was different because I was the author, well, I was the editor of the book, and my name was going to be on it. So when it came to writing my story, I really struggled with this. And so all my life, I've grown up with my guardian angel. I've always had a guardian angel who, you know, I always moved over and made room for her on my chair. And I had a hollow in my bed into which we both fell. So she's always been there. And as I was trying to think, how on earth am I going to tell this story? I don't know how it came to me, but I decided I was going to tell the story in the voice of my guardian angel, who actually had, you know, had been with me all along. And she had this really interesting voice. She had a sort of slightly gossipy voice. You know, she was the sort of voice of the person who folded her arms and leaned on the garden fence. And she would say things like, well, we all know it wasn't right. We all knew it at the time, but nobody was taking any notice. And in that kind of voice, well, not quite as extreme as that, but I found that really helpful because I was writing about myself, but I was writing about her in the third person. Myself was she. And yet this was an insider voice writing about this third person. It was really, it freed me up a lot. It didn't completely do away with the fears, but it helped me to get close enough. So the 2 men, for instance, they started that book with a fairy tale about 2 little boys who lived in a village with their mummy and daddy, and so on and so on. And they told a little snapshot of their story at the beginning of that book in that kind of fairy story voice. And it was really amazing. I said to them, could you do that? Could you just go off and write a little fairy story about you too? And so they both went off and they each wrote one. And then apparently they got together and they joined them and they wrote them together. And of course, this whole journey for them was very healing because they had not liked each other. They had not been encouraged to know each other. And they just suddenly discovered each other and known that this other person had experienced the same as they had. And throughout the therapy, they would meet and talk for hours and share their experiences. And that was terribly therapeutic for them. And so writing this little snapshot fairy story was another way that they did that together. And they shared it and agreed it and said that was what it was like. They referred to this grandfather as, he was seen as the lovely, jolly, white-bearded Father Christmas, a lay preacher, the nice, kind man that parents were really pleased to give their children to take off on holiday with him, and so on. So I'm not really answering the specific question that you asked, but after that, I kind of found my own voice, and other people, the ones who wrote the Trauma of the Body and Transformation stories, they did that themselves. And they all decided they wanted to use their own names. We talked a lot about it and what that would cost and how that might impact on them. And they were all very certain that they would do that, except one woman. And when the book was published, I did a follow-up study. I asked them to talk about, you know, what the experience had been like, what they had valued, what they'd gained, what had been difficult, and so on. And so I have a paper written about that as a follow-up paper. And she wrote and said she didn't want to open the book. She was really upset when it came. And because she hadn't used her own name, she said it felt like she'd given her story away. And so I said to her, well, if there's a reprint, you can use your own name if you want to. And then she went into a complete flat spin. Oh, no, I couldn't do that. So we went through all these iterations of how to support her to do what felt right to her. And in the end, I had a book launch and I invited as many of the authors as could come along and talk about the experience. And she came, introduced herself by her name, and she talked about how upset she'd been that she didn't have her name on her story, and how she decided that if it was ever reprinted, she would, and it was, and so she has got her name on it now. But she also kind of worked it through and realized that she hadn't been doing that for herself. She'd been doing it for her husband. She thought that he wouldn't like it because that would mean he could be identified. Mm-hmm. So she worked through a huge amount of stuff, just really deciding to change her decision about that. Yeah, I suppose the men in the study didn't all use pseudonyms. The 25 men, and they wanted that.
It's interesting that we can take different positions at different times of our lives, isn't it? And
yeah,
that's okay. You know, we want to be fluid. We don't want to be cemented. And
yeah.
So what we feel at one moment, it's not right.
Yeah.
Another moment in our lives, we may feel, no, it's very right now.
Yes.
Kim, I'm really taken with, you mentioned earlier on about this, you painted us a picture of yourself as a young person reading stories and immersed in others' stories, yet not feeling you had your own story.
Yeah.
To share. I just so often in our narrative research, we are interviewing people who don't believe they have a story, or that their story isn't worth being heard, us hearing it, being shared, being told. And I'm sort of thinking, and you talk about your therapy practice as well. I'm feeling like you've got something. I want to learn a little bit from you about how you work with people in therapy, in narrative research, either or both, to help to support people who may feel their story isn't there or isn't worth telling, or they're not able to tell it, or any combination of those things.
Yes, and it's all of those, actually. There are some people who can't tell their story. Their bodies tell their story for them. And so we try, I try to give the body a voice. At the moment, I've moved through a whole different set of therapeutic approaches. And the one, I'm an EMDR therapist, a trauma therapist, realizing a lot of the talking therapy wasn't quite reaching the actual traumas. And it gets people to a stage where they can actually then begin to touch the trauma. But within all of that, now I'm working with an internal family systems model, in which the idea is that we all have parts. And I can definitely say that's true, because I've got about 30. And so it works on the idea that, so for instance, the part that's speechless is a part that we have to get to know in other ways. But very often there is a part that can speak for that part. And so, and that's often an older part that is kind of like my guardian angel, a sort of an onlooker who can tell you what it is that the little one is actually worried about. That sounds a little bit complicated, but actually it's a really beautiful model. It's simple, uncomplicated, unpathologizing, and very, very creative, but also really successful. And I've been completely blown away by this different model of working. But when you started asking that question, David, it reminded me again of something that happened with the two men. That conversation we had about the ethics, the ethical issues at the beginning, and what are we going to do? How are we going to do this together? Really just starting from really the not knowing position, sharing our ideas, thinking about, but I've lost my train of thought. What were we talking about?
I'm just hearing so many parallels, Kim, in what you described in your therapeutic practice there. Yes. With narrative research and autoethnography. So time and time and again, I can't express my experiences in autoethnography through a word. Yes. I can't create a story. I'd have to go to music, to song, yes, to image. So I'm fascinated in whether you've been able to take any of those lessons you've learned through your therapeutic practice and working with the brothers or others and bring them into research. Can we use those as narrative researches, as autoethnographies to help?
Oh, absolutely. One of my PhD students, most of her dissertation was through artwork. And people can often draw or create something visual, as you know, which in itself then allows them to talk to it, to tell a story. So when somebody creates something and you say, tell me about it, you know, where did you begin, for instance? And then the story will unfold. So I think we just, you know, I think autoethnography narrative is an extremely creative methodology. And I think storytelling is at the heart of therapy. That's what people come to do, you know, they come to tell their story. I've always invited people to write poems or to draw pictures or to create something. You know, this is something I created, which was, I couldn't express what it was. It's a mother and child. You know, this is the way we reach ourselves. This is how we give expression. There's so many different ways, and of course music, singing, dancing, moving, and we've seen a lot of this in the autoethnography world, haven't we? Yeah. Oh, the thing I was going to say to you was that chapter, the ethics chapter, we covered all these different things, and after the book was published a few years, I had a letter from the BBC asking if they could turn part of it into a sort of documentary. And I was scared stiff, but I didn't know what to say. I really didn't want to have to do this, but I sent the letter to the two men separately, and I just said, you know, have a think about it, and I will support you whatever you decide to do. And it took them ages to come back to me. And then one of the men came back to me and he said he was speaking on behalf of his brother who wasn't very well at the moment. And he said, we sat down and we went through all those things that you and we had talked about at the beginning of the book. And we were working out, you know, what would it mean? That was the question I was asking them. What would it mean to have your name on this book or not have your name on this book? What would it mean to your children, to your partners, and so on and so on? And they said, we are so honored and moved by the fact that somebody thinks our story is worth telling. That was the point. And they couldn't believe that it was, you know, really going to be of any value. So that was his first response. But then they said, having given it a lot of thought and consideration, they decided, no, they were not going to do this. It was very different having their story in the pages of a book, which would be read by a limited number of people, but to have something beamed into your home in the living room, maybe with who knows sitting watching it, they didn't think that that was a good idea at all. And I was just so touched that they'd used that experience of thinking about something in an ethical way and being able to apply it themselves. I mean, one of them was a doctor, and so he had a view of ethics, you know, medical ethics and relationships and so on. So that was, I found that was very exciting to me, what they did with that.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah, I am. One of the things that I really enjoyed when we did the Qualitative Conversations film with you, there was a lot of laughter. And I remember you talking about how you write. And I think I'm right in quoting you. You said, after I passed my PhD, I did what I bloody well liked.
Yes.
So, but tempering that, you also say we need to be judicious about what we write about as autoethnographers.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can just talk about that a little bit. What are the tensions, and how do you negotiate those things? Yes.
Well, there's two questions or two answers in there for me. I felt very freed up once I had my PhD. I had a sort of an image of what you were supposed to remember. I'd seen my husband doing his PhD. That was really what I knew about PhDs, writing unintelligible stuff with numbers and graphs and Z's and K's all over the place, and that only certain people could read. And so mine, I couldn't kind of put myself in the same category at all. But I knew I had to sort of obey certain rules or work within certain parameters. But I knew I couldn't compromise it. So for instance, I used I all the way through. And I think that was enough, really. That was, I didn't say the author anywhere. This, as I say, this was 1993. I was doing the interviews. 1994, I think I submitted. I think it was the fastest PhD in the West. I got in and I got out, having done a lot of the literature before I'd even sat down, in a bench at the university. It was, I always knew this isn't what and how I wanted to write, but I knew that I had to do a certain amount of the right stuff in order to get what I wanted. And what I wanted was recognition in terms of being a woman and being, clever enough to get a PhD, because I really struggled with my O-levels because I was absent most of the time. So I wanted to get to a point where I wasn't going to be judged by what I just do the judging thing first. But you must remember, it's very different now from what it was then. Nobody had ever heard of narrative or autoethnography at Bristol University in those days at that time. It wasn't much longer before we started to educate. But now there are whole programs, there are whole conferences, there are, journals, there are people versed in the ability to support somebody through that process. I had a professor of social work who told me afterwards she would never have touched it with a barge pole if she'd been me. that was how supportive. She did always tell me I was a clever girl when I went in, so that was really good for me. But she refused to work with a second supervisor. She said she didn't think that was a good idea. And the second supervisor would have actually been somebody from my own department, a counsellor, who would have actually been quite good support for me, because I didn't really get any support. So it was, yeah, I did think I had to do it, but now I think it's different. I don't think anybody has to do that anymore. And I think the most important thing is finding the right environment in which to do it. finding that you've got the right people to support you, and that, you know, you've been put, that supervisor will put you in touch with this whole world where, you know, you can have colleagues, you can make friends, and you've got journals, and you've got webinars, and you've got lovely conferences where people dance and sing. I think that's so different now. But judicious, yes. It's quite a nice word, that, isn't it? Well, after we had that conversation, I went and looked up, and the antonym of it is something like, oh, I can't remember now, but it was being injudicious, which was really not okay. You know, you were not doing the right thing at all. I do think when we use ourselves, we have to do it purposefully. And I think we have to do it so that we can add something that couldn't be added in another way. Our unique personal story will in some way reach somebody and touch theirs and create something new. I do think I've seen dissertations where there's been a lot of extraneous stuff, you know, like decorative flourishes rather than useful, evocative, transformative writing and reading. And there is, you know, some people, I think, mistakenly think that's what's expected of them. So I do think we have to judge what's useful, why are we doing it, what does it add, could it be done better in another way? That's my answer to that question.
That's lovely. What can our personal story add that can't be added in any other way? Fantastic. Just would like to take, in the chat, there's a question from Paul Mollett. I hope you don't mind me reading this, Paul. So Paul's asked, Kim, as a fellow therapist, I was wondering how you navigated having your stories out in the world with your professional identity. I can sort of identify with that, not as a therapist, but as an academic as well. We talked about it in an earlier panel, actually. Could you speak to that, perhaps?
Yes. Surprisingly, maybe, a lot of people have told me that's why they came to me, because they, from what I'd written and how I'd written about it, they felt it would be safe and that I would understand in a way that nobody else might. Somebody who hadn't gone through a similar experience. I have to say, you know, there are things I haven't written about, and I'm still struggling to know whether I ever could. And I'm still having those fights with myself, so I'm being judicious. But I think it depends what kind of a therapist you are, Paul. I mean, somebody who's in a psychoanalytical or psychodynamic field values the blank screen. They don't, you know, they don't have pictures of their family in the room. I come from a very different kind of therapeutic world. I use myself as a myself in the therapy that I offer. You know, we talk about this thing about self-disclosure, which of course is in a parallel way what we do in autoethnography. And again, you know, we were taught that self-disclosure needs to be for the benefit of the client. So if we have a client who, for instance, is struggling with something, cannot speak about something, is too full of shame, to be able to say, yes, it's really hard, isn't it? I've struggled with shame, can be very freeing, can, you know, help that person to loosen up around it. You're not asking them to do that. I'm not asking them to speak about something that's very shameful, but I'm saying, yes, it is. It's really the hardest thing that you can do. And I sometimes add, and I know it's the most useful thing, because that's how we deal with shame, or whatever it is that they're worried about. So I have a very different attitude to being seen for who I am as a therapist. Actually, I couldn't do the work I do, and I couldn't do the research I do and the writing I do unless I had that. It's like, it's actually about, you know, it's not me the therapist and me the researcher, it's me. And living an autoethnographic life, I suppose somebody said that. And I don't think you can help it once you get stung by this thing. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Kim. It really does. It was a real light bulb moment for me when you said that's why they seek you out. And I found when I do self-disclose at important moments, it really helps. And my battle is that my training is psychodynamic.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to marry these two worlds, which don't seem to go together, and two parts of myself. I feel like I'm on the right track to doing that, but there's going to be a lot of resistance in me and other people, I feel. But that was really helpful. Thank you.
Good.
Kim, Art has his hand up, and I would hate him not to. We've just a few minutes left, so Art, please.
Thank you, and thank you for a marvelous interview and presentation. I learned so much that I didn't know about you, Kim, and it's all wonderful. And I do appreciate your talk about how the stories are often in us. We don't necessarily come to it. I want to make a brief comment on the opportunity that seems so much wider than it once was. And there are people who have certainly helped us to introduce those opportunities. People like Pat Sykes, people like Kim Etherington.
That's me.
People like Norman Denson,
Yeah.
People like Laurel Richardson.
Yeah.
And there's one unique thing about all those people I've mentioned, they're all retired. Okay. And so retired, you know, in quotes. So I still think there are incredible power struggles within universities and within departments in psychology, in sociology, in communication studies, etc. And I do worry about where, at least in the university world, people get this welcoming mat. You can do this work. We have people to work with you, to, you know, mentors who will do it. I don't see a lot of those mentors being hired. And I worry about the continuing struggle because the power centers continue to be grant-getting quantitative researchers, et cetera. So I don't know if you have any comments on that, but it is a concern that I have. Yes, there are journals and there certainly are outlets, but in terms of the reward system itself and in terms of the curriculum needs to be there. We need to be teaching about narrative, to have writing workshops and performance workshops, et cetera. So within departments. So yeah. I wondered what your thoughts are about that.
I absolutely agree with you. We were very fortunate. Jane Speedy and I sort of on the back of an envelope wrote a course called Narrative and Life Story Research, which was a module of the Ed.D. And Jane was a great one for battling. She was full-time at the university and I was part-time, very part-time, sort of two days a week contract or something like that. And she was pretty good at people, you know, hearing. She could deliver that message and she could get her own way. And then we would just have a free rein and we would go with it. And I think sometimes it is about, I don't know, I think we were fortunate in Bristol, I suppose. We then developed a narrative centre, the Centre for Narrative and Transformative Learning. And so I've seen in other places, these centres can be set up where it gives validation to these kind of methodologies. But you see, I think that thing about me never having been fully in the university God knows how I ever got to be a professor, because, you know, I didn't sort of do that. I didn't go to meetings, and I didn't, you know, I had a post which was, I did all my research and my writing in my own time. I never had any funded research except the drugs research. So I didn't engage with that. I just did it. And I think maybe it's different in the States, or maybe not. I just think for me, it was healthy that I had the therapeutic world and the research world. And so I could keep a foot, and actually one helped the other. You know, they were all part and parcel of a very whole kind of development in terms of my belief in narrative and the, you know, knowledge construction through poetry and writing and stories. And
I'm going to leap in here because I'm really aware that there's a schedule here. There's another session coming, and there's a tight turnaround, and people have to spend a penny, get a cup of tea, a glass of water. And Kim's been talking for nearly 50 minutes. But Kim, I have to tell you that the chat box is absolutely chock-a-block of people saying how wonderful you are, what lovely stories, how informative, and how just you've touched on areas that are really meaningful for them. So please, Tony, if you're still here, or whoever's got their hand on the button, can you download the chat and send it to Kim, because I know that she'd like to read all of your comments. If any of you have any comments for Kim, please email her. She's a wonderful, she replies to emails and likes to get in conversation. And so, Kim, I just want to really thank you for everything that you've shared today from David and I. And thank you, Art, Caroline and Tony and all the others for inviting us and coming here today. Thank you.